All right, everybody, if you listen to our Ballistics for Beginners podcast, we have the same guy back as his instructor, Justin. So Justin loves talking about long-range stuff so much, he had to come back to talk to all of you about ballistics for nerds. Justin, I think one of the best parts about the last episode, and you even caught me in a couple instances on that episode, where we were talking about things that I was like, well, that's definitely like a ballistics for nerds thing. But nowadays, I think with so many resources available to people and so much easy technology that you can use, there are a lot of pieces of the puzzle that you can actually input to get really accurate information just as a beginner with stuff that you got for free on your phone or off of an easy-to-access spec sheet off the gun or the ammunition, you know. And so that's really, really cool. So when we go into ballistics for nerds, we're really getting into some of that like fine minutia.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the things when it comes to like more advanced ballistics, some of that information may not be readily available. And the reason for it is there's so many variables kind of involved in that equation. So yes, it may function and perform similar to from one gun to the other gun, but caliber to caliber, it's just completely across the board. So it's a little bit harder to find that information, and it's almost like on a individual type level.
Right. So you kind of went over a few of the things that we're going to talk about today. I think these are things where, like you said, they're going to vary a lot. And they're items where you're going to start needing maybe some additional equipment to start getting them really accurately. So having that chronograph where we mentioned it's maybe not an absolute necessity. If you are in that beginner level, there may be ways to sort of figure your way at least closer to your actual muzzle velocity, even using the thing on the speed on the back of the box and then just a little deduction when you're actually shooting. Now you really want to have that chronograph. Maybe you're even looking into getting some other devices that can get really accurate atmospheric data right at your location of shooting, like a Kestrel, for example. Some of this stuff is going to come into play. But after all, you've now considered yourself a nerd in terms of ballistics, so you're going to have to get some of that, some of those goodies.
I remember last time we were kind of talking about the basics, right? You could get by with a lot just with generic data and utilizing maybe a simple ballistic solver that you might find on the internet. Now when we kind of start diving down deeper into that rabbit hole, a solid ballistic solver and a software program is really going to be beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of these things? Like I know one of the ones you mentioned is actually figuring out your standard deviation on your particular rifle and ammunition that you're shooting.
Absolutely. Now, standard deviation is going to be more or less kind of correlated directly with your type of ammunition, right? We're not worried about so much external factors at this point, like atmospherics. So I would probably start there because understanding that is really going to help you kind of deduce what's going on at extended distances. So standard deviation, more or less, kind of in layman's terms, is about how consistent those rounds are from shot to shot.
Yeah.
You can
it's strictly related to muzzle velocity, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Now, standard deviation, a lot of people don't understand, is if you fire 5 rounds, it's going to give you, say, for example, depending on your chronograph, maybe give you a min and a max, which would be your extreme spread. And then also on there, you might have an average, and your average is what you would actually put in the ballistic software. However, it should possibly give you, depending on your chronograph, standard deviation. Now, standard deviation doesn't mean all of your rounds are going to be plus or minus, say, 10 feet per second. There's only a percentage of those rounds are actually going to fall within those parameters.
Okay.
So
got it. So, like, let's give a real example here real quick, because maybe some of those folks, you know, they stumbled into this after the Ballistics for Beginners. They just kept listening, and they're a little lost already. But a real example would be, let's take 6.5 Creedmoor. It's very common. People are starting to see that everywhere now. And not all that uncommon to see it anywhere between 2,600 and 2,700 feet per second, all ammo and rifle dependent, right?
Yeah.
So if I was using a chronograph on my 6.5 Creedmoor and I shot 5 times, let's say I got, like, we'll give it an example of not so great standard deviation, right? So I got 2,600 feet per second on my first shot. I got 2,610 on my second shot. I got 2,630 on my third shot. 2,600 again on my fourth shot, and on my fifth shot, I got like 2,670. Right, I'm all over the board. So our standard deviation is going to be quite high in that case because it's saying, you had this really extreme spread, and also within that extreme spread, the values were sort of all over the place. There's, the what is it? Basically the average of the different distance between each round was quite high. Yep. So it's harder to predict. It's harder for the solver. You're going to have to plug in that high standard deviation that the chronograph sort of in its own little software gave you. You're going to have to plug that into the ballistic solver, and you're basically telling the ballistic solver, give me a solution, but also realize that we're going to be ballparking it a lot more than we want to be because I can't even rely on my ammo to be all that consistent.
Absolutely. You can only give the ballistic software so many inputs. You can only give the ballistic software, for example, one muzzle velocity.
Yeah.
All right. So you only have one of those data points. So when you do chronograph, it would always behoove you to shoot as many rounds as possible so you have a bigger pool of data to pull from. Like with any other survey, you're not going to conduct a survey with one person. The data may be skewed.
It may be. It may be.
Now with standard deviation, kind of like what we like to see with factory grade ammunition, that you can buy right off the shelf, would be ideally 15 feet per second and below for what we consider acceptable. To kind of give you guys an idea, like hand loaders, I would say, are probably chasing those single-digit SDs.
Right, so anything below 10.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And there, I think the idea is that the large bulk percentage of all your shots will be within 10 feet per second of the muzzle velocity you gave the ballistics calculator to do all of its calculations off of, right?
So, yes. Now, when we kind of talk about your extreme spread and standard deviation, the higher your standard deviation is, obviously you're going to have a greater, extreme spread.
Sure.
Now, you may get away with quite a bit of deviation at closer distances. But when you start reaching out to further distances, based on your extreme spread and that muzzle velocity, how consistent that is from round to round, you may impact the target, say, dead center, right where you're aiming. Point of aim, point of impact. Awesome. Your next round may be low. All right.
And you executed the same shot, everything, and all that, but now just because it's not consistent, it went low.
And now the next shot may be a little bit high.
Right. In an ideal world, there's zero standard deviation. Every round that leaves the barrel is leaving it the exact same way that the last round left it, and the last round and the last round. But sadly, we don't live in that world. Yeah. But we can try to get as close to it as we can. That's why a lot of people hand load. So, yeah.
Now there's a fine line because people are chasing, okay, well, I want to chase single-digit SDs. Okay, I'm down to, say, 2.1, feet per second standard deviation. But also you have to find that happy medium because now maybe on paper your accuracy isn't there. So maybe you have great SDs, but your accuracy kind of falls to the wayside. I
was going to ask you that if there's a potential where you might have a higher SD, but actually not be in as bad of a position. And so SD is not a determining factor in accuracy.
No.
So you might have just a horrible group at 100 yards, but boy, oh boy.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
SD was single digits, my man.
And it can be the reverse as well.
Okay, sure. That's very odd.
Yeah. You're not going to see a whole lot of deviation at those distances.
Okay.
So when you start really kind of pushing it out and things like that. And then when some people do chronograph, they'll be like, okay, well, I have, say you fired, say 5 shots, but you have one extreme outlier that's, maybe you shot 5 rounds and all 5 of those rounds or 4 of those rounds are plus or minus, maybe 5 feet per second.
Yeah.
So looking really good. And then you have that one outlier. Some people are like, well, I want to delete that guy because it's going to skew my data.
Yeah.
Well, if you do that, I mean, that's still part of the ammunition you're going to shoot, maybe still part of the same lot, still part of the same load develop. I mean, all of that still comes into play. So I would caution individuals if they do want to delete any outliers. I kind of suggest against it because that can skew your data.
It seems like because of what you said earlier, rather than deleting one outlier, you instead should shoot more and test more over your chronograph to maybe actually just, instead of just all deleting it, you might smooth it over more and then find out later on, okay, was that truly an outlier? Because now I shot 20, 25, 30, however many rounds it is, and that's still the only one that's way out there, in which case maybe at that point you can start doing something different with it. But if you smoothed it over that time, I'd feel a little bit more confident in my data personally than I would if I were like, we'll just get rid of it.
Oh, absolutely. So, but that can lead into a lot of other ballistics as well. But that's kind of what's happening, kind of right here at the gun.
Mm-hmm.
When we start talking about more advanced ballistics, secondary effects, maybe aerodynamic jump or spin drift or things like that come into play as well. But I like to start with standard deviation when I talk about advanced ballistics because that's what's going on right here.
Sure. And, the nice thing is, I will say, we've mentioned hand loading a few times, but I know I've shot factory match-grade ammunition out of my long-range rifles before, and you put them over a chronograph, and generally speaking, they tend to do pretty well.
Yeah,
they tend to shoot good groups, and they tend to have a standard deviation that's not awful, and, I can hit targets pretty well, but, that may just be something that you wish to keep chasing. A lot of people chase their tails to try and get it as low as possible.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
By then, maybe your barrel shot out and you have to start all over.
Hey, if that's what you like to do, then by all means, more power to you. So, what are some of these other advanced effects? You've said some of the terminologies. You said aerodynamic jump, spin drift. I think these are either they're left-right things or aerodynamic jump being an up-down thing, but it's caused by wind, and wind is a huge thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the thing that you can factor into ballistics calculators. You can tell ballistics, okay, I've got a prevailing wind going this direction at about this much. But even still, you can't. Well, I shouldn't say you can't, because maybe there is one out there. But it's really, really hard to be like, okay, ballistics calculator, between me and 300 yards, there's a wind doing this, and me, 300 yards to 400, there's a wind doing that, because it's all over the map.
Absolutely. When it comes to aerodynamic jump, we can account for that. We can account for spin drift. The reason being is because it's a constant that we know. Basically, it's just a math formula at that point. The one thing that's not constant is that wind you were talking about. Mm-hmm. So by far, the hardest aspect about shooting long range is wind. Now, spin drift alone, even if there's absolutely no wind, all right, say you do have a 1,000-yard indoor range, for example.
That'd be so cool.
Yeah, we might run out with max sword and things like that, but I think we could possibly
just make it really tall.
But yeah, so spin drift alone, based on your rifle twist, you are going to have a little bit of left-right deviation in there.
Okay.
More or less right, I would say, because I've yet to come across a left-hand twist.
Australia. That's where. Everything twists the other direction down there. Okay, so we kind of threw three things out there because we're talking about wind, aerodynamic jump, spin drift. We're on the spin drift train. You've brought that up. Spin drift is a very peculiar one. Now, it's something that oftentimes your ballistic calculator may already be factoring it in without you realizing it, because if it asked you at some point what your barrel's twist rate is, it might, again, without you even realizing it may have assumed that right-hand twist. Because you said that's what they usually are, right?
Yep.
Right-hand twist. So it may already be factoring that in. You don't even realize it. And actually, as you plug in values for your distance, if you plug in a pretty far distance, you may see, without even putting in any wind, all of a sudden it's telling you to dial 0.1, 0.2 mils or something like that. And you're wondering, why is that? I didn't even give it any wind yet. So this is just an aspect of the fact that the bullet is spinning.
Yes.
In the air, that actually can cause it to kind of veer or something?
Kind of in layman's terms, because you do have a right-hand twist in there, all right, that bullet does have that right twist coming out, kind of like the spiral on a football. Well, over time, it's going to more or less kind of drift that way to the right. Most spin drift, like I said, due to the rifle twist, is going to be to the right. Excuse me, got to clear my throat there.
Oh, all good.
But something we have to take into account, not just the rifle twist rate, but also how efficient that bullet is as well. So you may not run into spin drift, or you may not have to account for it, size of the target, distance of the target, until further out. So, for example, maybe you're shooting a 308 versus, say, like a 6.5 Creedmoor or something like that. You could probably push out a little bit further and get away with it a little bit more with like a 6.5 Creedmoor versus a 308, where a 308 is going to be maybe starting to affect it, say it's 600 yards, and maybe it's 0.2 mils you have to account for with generic data.
Yeah.
Versus a 6.5 Creedmoor, maybe now you're talking about 800 or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, that one's definitely a peculiar one. You don't always think about the fact that a bullet could just start veering on its own. And then that getting factored in as well with the wind. If it's not,
Absolutely.
if spin drift just isn't a thing in your head, it could be that if you see it occur and say it causes you to either miss a target or to hit a target not exactly where you were anticipating it in the target, then you could misinterpret that as wind. And then, okay, now I think there's wind going on down there, and then you start accounting for wind that's not really there, and then that, these all things can all compound, and so as long as you got to be aware of it.
Absolutely. And when we teach like wind reading, for example, we try to do it without factoring in spin drift right off the bat.
Okay.
The reason being is because we only want to give you one thing to focus on at a time.
Yeah.
Make a wind call. Oh, also factor in spin drift.
Yeah. But spin drift, though, at least is kind of like you said, it's sort of a constant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thing. It's like you said, it's a math equation basically. It's not like, oh, the spin drift is really high today. I don't know, unless certain conditions can cause spin drift to
again
show itself more.
Well, kind of going back to atmospherics, right? Yeah. When you have temperature, the density, altitude, the air molecules, what they're doing, does it have more resistance on that bullet? Does it have less resistance on that bullet? Things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a good thing we have ballistics calculators to figure that out for us.
Yeah, somebody a lot smarter than me kind of put that together.
How about we'll go backwards. We'll make our way to wind. Wind it does so many things. It does the one thing we've mentioned now, aerodynamic jump.
Yeah, absolutely.
So explain that, because there's a lot of effort that goes into explaining to people oftentimes that when a bullet leaves your barrel, it doesn't immediately go up. It immediately starts dropping as soon as it leaves your barrel. Now, we're oftentimes the things that make it go up in the air because we're trying to arc it to get over to our target if the target's far away. But actually, in some cases, we have this thing called aerodynamic jump.
Yeah.
So what is that?
So depending on the direction of wind, depending on the caliber and the wind speed, it can actually cause you to have a elevation change up or an elevation change down.
Mm-hmm.
So again, in layman's terms, depending on who you talk to, they could be like, well, actually, this is what's kind of going on, and they can really dive in the weeds with it. But for most people to understand, you have a right-hand twist, right?
Okay.
So your bullet's coming out to the right, spinning to the right. Now, if the wind is coming, say, from your left to right, all right, it's going to push that bullet down.
Okay.
Now, if it's coming from the right to left, because you have that right-hand twist, it's going to push it up. So, and now you might be thinking, well, okay, what if I'm shooting a 6.5 Creedmoor? Is that going to have less or more? Kind of playing with the ballistic software and things like that. Actually, come to find out, it's going to have more effect on a 6.5 Creedmoor.
Than, say, something with lower BC?
Yeah, like maybe not so much the BC, but like a 308 is going to have less effect with aerodynamic jump. When I was playing with the numbers...
That is counterintuitive.
It is. And the reason it kind of comes down to it is when you kind of play with all the numbers in the ballistic software, you can kind of start deducing what factors actually kind of come into play. When I did it with another instructor here, what we kind of found out was bullet weight comes into play, as well as rifle twist. So how fast or slow that twist rate is.
Interesting.
So,
what sort of variables do you play with in the ballistics calculator to get it to start, or to start seeing how aerodynamic jump is coming into play? Do ballistics calculators actually, they can factor in aerodynamic jump?
Certain ones, not all of them, but yes, certain ballistic software programs out there can factor in aerodynamic jump.
What would be one that you use?
The Kestrel. So the Kestrel Elite Series, the Applied Ballistics in there does have that.
Oh, okay. And is that because with the Kestrel you can grab the wind that's going on, right? Basically at the muzzle, and you can see the direction that it's coming from and all that stuff.
Absolutely.
And so it can factor that in. Okay. So what do you start kind of toying with to see its effect between certain different bullets?
The first thing I do is I adjust the wind. Because at first I want to know how much wind speed aerodynamic jump comes into play. And when you factor in wind speed, we also have to factor in direction of fire, or that clock value, if you were.
Right.
The reason being is because we need to account for aerodynamic jump with a full 100% wind value coming from, say, like the 3 or 9 o'clock, because that's what it's based off of.
Yeah.
So first I want to find out how much wind, all right, full value, is going to have any effect on it. Once I find that out, I'll be like, okay, now I have a set distance, a set mile per hour value wind where aerodynamic jump is becoming a thing.
Oh, so it doesn't necessarily, like if you just have like a light little 3 mile per hour wind or something like that, it's probably not going to, there's a certain
threshold.
Okay, interesting.
Now, just like when we build our short wind formula chart to call winds, we can more or less kind of build a chart out, or wind brackets, if you will, for aerodynamic jump alone. So, and it's kind of like if you build, say for whatever reason, your particular projectile is affected by a 9 mile per hour wind.
Okay.
Now, if you double that, the effect is going to be, again, doubled. So if you have a 9 mile an hour full value wind and aerodynamic jump is, say, 0.1 mils, well, if you double that mile per hour, it's still going to double the value for aerodynamic jump.
It works out that way?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So in aerodynamic jump, it doesn't occur like at distance. So for example, if you're shooting a target, say 200 yards away even, right? So fairly close. Aerodynamic jump still can become a thing.
Oh, okay.
Yep, because we are accounting for just that vertical deviation. So for example...
So spin drift wasn't necessarily something that we thought about a whole lot until we got to further distances. But aerodynamic jump could happen even at
say in the first 100 yards or so.
Intermediate distances. Okay.
Yep. So if you have, say you're on the range and you're like, okay, well, wind's really not a factor, at my 100-yard zero. So my zero shouldn't be entirely that off. But now you're like, okay, well, why am I a little bit high? Why am I a little bit low? Well, is it super windy that day? So yes, you might have a little bit of left-right deviation, but you also may be a little bit high and low.
Oh, so then that's good to know, because it may prevent you from making an unnecessary change to a zero or something like that.
Absolutely.
Huh. Okay. And then obviously downrange, it can affect too, just your accuracy and making sure you hit the target.
Yeah.
So something to be factored in.
Yep.
Okay. So what is, I actually always thought that aerodynamic jump had to do with shooting into a full head-on wind. Because you hear about a lot of people talk about these things like in hunting scenarios, because oftentimes when you're hunting, you may be trying to get high ground somehow. Sometimes guys will, obviously they're trying not to skyline themselves necessarily, but they'll be high up on a hill shooting down perhaps.
Absolutely.
And they have this big gust of wind coming up the hill at them. Is that considered aerodynamic jump when they talk about elevation changes from that?
I would say more or less that's just wind alone.
Yeah.
Yes, it can have a little bit of effect, vertical or otherwise. But the problem we kind of run into with that is some people assume, now the distances I'm talking about right now are, say, maybe 1,200 yards and in.
Mm-hmm.
So still fairly long, right?
Yeah.
Now, when we talk about headwinds and tailwinds, it's not like an airplane. So you know how the pilot's like, hey, we're going to get there 2 hours early because we have a nice strong tailwind.
Jet stream.
Not the case with a bullet.
Right.
It's not going to get there any faster, and it's not going to be any higher or anything like that. It has very minimal effect at those, 1,000 yards and in, even 1,200 yards and in. Again, based on the size of the target.
Mm-hmm.
Say you're trying to shoot, maybe, half MOA target at that distance, and yes, we maybe have to take that into consideration. But it's going to be very minimal.
Okay. Got it.
So same thing with a headwind. It's not going to slow that bullet down or anything like that, and it's not going to cause that bullet to strike any lower than it normally would.
Oh, okay, got it. I always thought that was how you got aerodynamic jump. Very interesting. So wind, though, I mean, just all in and of itself altogether is a wild thing. You can see wind downrange if you got tall grass between you and a target. If you've got, anything that can just kind of be influenced by the wind between you and the target. Wind can be, you can have many different winds, which is a weird thing to say, especially if you're newer to this. But you can have many different winds between you and the target. That can be affecting the bullet in different ways. What do you guys do, in your long range 2 and 3, when you're talking to students about wind? it seems obvious because you're like, well, yeah, it either could push it left or it could push it right. So just watch what it does and then make a correction accordingly.
Yeah.
That usually involves, okay, we got to take a few shots to see what happens. Then we got to make a follow-up now that we've made corrections. So sometimes people are out there and they're like, I'm going to get a first-round hit. So I got to start working on some stuff like this and figuring things out. Like where do you start?
So we start, now there's a lot of different ways to do this, just like mounting a rifle. Mounting a scope on a rifle. Sure. A lot of different ways you can do it. What I found works best for most students is first we have to determine the value per hour wind bracket that particular gun is in. So for example, if anybody's out there has ever heard of, well, I have a 5 gun, I have a 7 gun, things like that.
I haven't even heard that one.
So like I have a 7 mile per hour gun, or like what's your gun? Oh, it's a 7 gun or something like that.
Okay.
What those individuals may be referencing would be their wind brackets. So if you have a 5 mile an hour gun, or like a 5 gun, for example, your wind bracket values will be in 5 miles per hour. Now this is based on the short wind formula. A lot of different formulas out there for calling winds, but I like the short wind formula. It seems to be the most accurate.
Okay.
For
is it
my
short?
purposes and applet. It can be. Now the short wind formula is really designed around the mill shooter and not the MOA shooter.
Sorry, guys.
Another reason I prefer mills.
Okay. Good to know.
I've kind of learned on it in the past, and it's a pretty good formula that I have stuck with, and you can go ahead and true that formula up for your specific rifle. It's very easy to do.
So what is it?
So the short wind formula, so for example, if I was to build out a chart, okay, the first thing I'm going to have individuals do is we're going to have a couple constants in here.
Okay.
So what I'm going to have them do is go to their ballistic software. I'm going to have them zero out spin drift, because we don't want to factor in spin drift with this. We just want to concentrate on the wind. All right?
Got it.
Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have that individual set their yardage to 500 yards. And the reason I'm setting it to 500 yards is because I want to adjust the wind value, all right, in my ballistic software to match 0.5 or as close to 0.5 as possible for wind.
0.5 mils?
0.5 mils, correct.
And it's just that's likely to happen at 500 yards?
No, because so based on the short wind formula, if we were to build it out at 100 yards, your brackets and those numbers will not change. What will change is your value per hour in those brackets. So for example, if you're shooting, we'll keep it easy, and we kind of play with those numbers, and at 500 yards, if I adjust my wind for a full value from the 3 or the 9, it's going to tell me that I need a 0.5 mil hold.
Okay.
Now I just picked 5 miles per hour kind of out of the air. So
at 500 yards, you play with the wind value. You say, well, what if the wind was 13 miles an hour? You play with the wind value until the ballistic calculator is spitting out you would need a 0.5 mil hold.
Absolutely.
Okay, got it.
So now doing that, we can deduce like, okay, so whatever that value in miles per hour is, those are my wind brackets. So for example, if I have a 7 bracket, a 5 gun, so if I have a 7 mile an hour gun, if I have a 5 mile an hour gun, that's where you get that number from. Okay. So your wind brackets now would be 5 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, etc. So 5, 10, 15.
Okay.
Now, what you can do is at 100 yards, with a 5 mile an hour wind, you have to hold 0.1 mils. 200 yards with a 5 mile an hour wind, 0.2. 300, 0.3, 4, 0.4, and you build it all the way down.
Okay, so now, because 5 miles an hour in this made-up scenario, 5 miles an hour at 500 yards equaled 0.5 mils.
Yep.
So I see why that's just easy math for, again, our made-up scenario. So as you literally just, it's like a nice little converging triangle almost down to 100 yards, because you have, so then 400 would be 0.4, 300 would be 0.3, 200 would be 0.1 or 0.2, and 100 would be 0.1, all with that same 5 mile an hour wind.
Absolutely. Now, with your wind value brackets, so say now that 5 mile an hour wind, all right, doubles to your second wind bracket, which is 10 miles an hour. Well, now at 100 yards, instead of 0.1, now it's 0.2.
Yeah.
And that carries all the way down.
Sure. Okay.
All right. Now with a 15 mile an hour wind, All right. So a third wind bracket. All you're going to do is take 0.1, multiply by 3, because that's your
0.3.
third wind bracket. Now what? Yeah. 50
That's
mile.
100.
Yep. 0.3.
200, you're going to be at 0.6.
Yeah.
300, you're going to be at 0.9.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, and that's, so in this quote short wind formula, that's just where, well, and again, obviously we're making up a scenario where the math is super easy, but it gives you this kind of quick reference to like, okay,
Absolutely.
I'm noticing the wind. A lot of times too with wind, it seems like experience comes into play, because it takes a lot of, let me hold up my Kestrel. Let me see. I'm going to guess this is a 7 mile an hour wind. And you look at your Kestrel and you're like, dang, it's a 10, so it takes a lot of experience, but you can quickly, once you have that experience, be like, I'm seeing a 10 mile an hour wind from the left. I'm shooting at 300 yards. I've got a 7 gun. So like boop, boop, boop,
Yeah.
I know what to hold for my wind.
Absolutely.
Oh,
now,
okay.
for a 7 mile an hour gun, your holds in mils, so your 0.2 mil hold, et cetera, won't change. The only thing that will change is your wind value brackets. So all those numbers, the 0.1, the 0.2, those numbers stay the same across the board.
Oh, yeah. Wait, you're right. So it's just that it takes now 7 miles an hour to make it a 0.1 hold at 100 yards.
Absolutely.
And a 0.2 hold at 200 yards. Oh, so it's always 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4,
Yes.
0.5.
Absolutely.
It's just that now the multiple of the wind.
Absolutely. Because
what
now that's 7 mile an hour gun, maybe like a 6.5 Creedmoor. 5 mile an hour gun, maybe a 308.
Oh, okay. That's super cool.
Yeah. Now I'm going to kind of throw a wrench in it.
I always do this.
Now there's going to be at some point where it's going to make a jump. Now this is kind of your setup in particular. So I can't say all 6.5 Creedmoors are going to make a jump.
Oh, yeah.
At a certain distance.
Yeah.
But we have the remaining velocity. All right. So at extended distances, now remaining velocities, and there's a lot of other variables that come into play. But say now we are shooting a 6.5 Creedmoor, and we're now say we're at 700 yards, for example.
Okay.
So it should be like 0.7.
Sure. Yeah.
Right, for your first wind bracket.
Yeah, for 5 mile an hour wind in this case. Yeah.
But now it's going to make that jump. So instead of being a 0.7 at 700, now maybe it's a 0.8. And then it goes to 0.9 at 800, 1 at 900, and 1.1 at 1,000. And the reason being is because we have more, or possibly less remaining velocity on that round.
The bullet's slowing down.
Absolutely, and things like that.
There's more time between each 100-yard increment, and so therefore more opportunity for the wind to be pushing it
Absolutely.
further. So that
also the BC can be changing as well, depending on the velocity of that particular projectile. A lot of things can be happening.
That's right. So when you find that's the case, that jump, is that jump calculatable? What's the word? Calculable? Is it, or do you just have to find it by experience?
You can, depending on your ballistic software, you can go ahead, input your mile per hour value in.
Okay.
Then you can go to your range card, and you can look at what distance you're at, and then what it's going to tell you for wind. And then what you may notice is your short wind formula is going to match up until you hit, say, a certain yard line.
Yeah.
And then that wind correction that ballistic software is going to give you will make a jump. You're like, well, at 700 yards, it says, 0.77 mils.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be like, okay, now it's going to round up to 0.8 in my short wind formula bracket.
Okay. Got it.
But it is something you can factor in and easy to find.
Very interesting. I've said interesting so many times now in this podcast, I realize hopefully nobody made a drinking game out of that. Especially not if you're driving and listening right now. That would be a problem. Okay, cool. Wind.
Yes. Now, MOA's a different story.
Oh. Well, what do they do?
There's a lot, more or less, no.
Kentucky windage.
There's a lot of different formulas out there for MOA. But the problem is, what I've come to find out for me personally is that there's a lot more math involved, and it's not so short. The short wind formula is just that. It's easy math you can do on the fly and you can memorize it.
Yeah.
Versus a lot of formulas out there for MOA because we're dealing with, bigger numbers. It's not on 10th system,
or
things
fractions,
like that.
Yeah.
So now you may need, instead of just doing it in your head, be like, okay, at 0.7, or 700 yards, I'm at, say 0.7. Okay. But I'm in my second bracket. So now I'm, 1.4, for example.
Yeah.
Instead of doing something like that, you may need a calculator. Because you may have certain constants as well. So for our short wind formula, the constants was, 500 yards, 0.5. Right?
Yeah.
However, there's other formulas out there. So for MOA holds, it could be like range times velocity, divided by, let's say, another factor, which is the constant, right?
Yeah.
So range times velocity divided by, say, 10, which would be the constant. Well, that's pretty easy figuring. Mm-hmm. But what if the constant's not 10?
Right.
What if the constant's 12?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, or some other.
Yeah, and so it'd be range
number
expressed in hundredths, for example. So let's say, 5, right?
Okay.
Let's keep it the same, right? 5 miles per hour, 500 yards. So we have range expressed in hundredths. So 5 times 5 would be
25.
25. Now you're going to take that.
I didn't realize you were going to put me on the spot today. I was, all right, 20,
all right,
yeah.
Yeah, 25. All right, now we divide that by the constant.
Okay.
So say 10, for example. Yeah. So we take 25 divided by 10, and that gives us
2.5.
2.5. So that would be the MOA hold for a full value win.
Right.
However,
this further reminds me why MOA is not as fun to shoot with.
Absolutely.
Because then when I hear 2.5, I'm like, okay, well, that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. That's going to be 8, 10 clicks. You know what I mean? Anyway, carry on.
But the constant may not be 10.
Right, exactly.
And that's something just like you're going to have to do.
That's like when you're ranging with MOA too, and you get a value, and then the constant's like, I don't even remember what it is. It's 9.7. It's some odd or something like that, or 63 point. I can't remember. Yeah. But yeah, they get
absolutely
the numbers tend to get odd.
Yes, and so with the short wind formula, there's really no conversion to MOA because it's not short. It's not a short formula anymore.
Right.
So just like with the other short wind formula, you kind of have to true it up based on your particular setup. Mm-hmm. So such as your mile per hour brackets.
Yeah.
You have to do the same thing with MOA formula, right? You may okay, and I'm going to switch the numbers a little bit. I'm going to say the constant's now 12. Now I'm going to do the math, check out what the ballistic software tells me, and be like, okay, nope, 12's off, it's actually 13. Yeah. So now you take range times velocity, which was 25, right? That's what we came up with. All right, divide that by 13 now. I can't do that off the top of my head.
No.
So.
Yeah, I don't want to do that at the range. I just don't. It is very interesting. I don't want to say it again. Sorry. It's very thought-provoking.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that, I don't know what, I woke up today and it was just an interesting kind of day, I guess. But so much of long-range shooting, what you're describing with even the short wind formula, or if you do your MOA thing, whatever that ends up being, so much of it happens before you shoot.
Absolutely, because you have to figure out all those constants.
Yeah.
You have to figure out, and when we were talking about that MOA wind formula, that's one example of the many formulas out there for calling winds.
Right.
For MOA. There's also like range -1. So if you're shooting 400 yards and you have a 10 mile an hour full value wind, you're like, okay, well, range -1 would be 3.
Okay.
So now I'm going to shoot for a full value 10 mile per hour wind. I'm going to have a 3 MOA hold.
Yeah.
But the problem is when it comes to all these formulas, whether it's the short wind formula, whether it's the MOA formula, we just have to figure out the equation and the numbers to put in that equation.
Right.
So instead of, say, 2 + 2 = 4, maybe it's 1 + 3 = 4.
Got it.
And we just have to kind of play with those numbers a little bit.
Figure out what numbers
absolutely
give you. Huh. Yeah, you do end up having to do a lot before you actually shoot. And I feel like that's what really separates the beginners from the nerds, right?
Absolutely.
And if you are a beginner, you can eat very quickly, and I've seen it become a nerd in this whole thing. But as a beginner, oftentimes what I feel like people find themselves doing is they go out to the range and they get basic data, just generally, speaking, and it's close enough to get them. It's close enough to get them close enough to the target, I keep blanking here because we're getting a lot of rain. If you can hear that, the soothing sounds behind our voices is the rain hammering away at this roof right over our heads in the armory here. And also, I think we just got some thunder. But anyway, so they get generic data, and they get close enough with the data to get close enough to the target to see dirt kick up behind the target, either to the left or to the right or above or below.
Absolutely.
And so they can, take that first shot, maybe first 2 shots or something like that, and actually visually see impacts and then make adjustments accordingly. And usually those adjustments are, come up a click, come over to the right 2 clicks, something like that.
Absolutely.
And they can have fun in that regard. Okay, yeah, hey, it took me a little bit of try, but look at that. I hit that target 1,000 yards away. But when you really get into this, you start to find out that there's a lot you can do before you ever even get to the range, just in your house. And you start playing with data, and you start playing with the numbers, and you figure out ways where it's like, well, next time I go to the range, I'm going to set up, I'm going to get out that Kestrel that I've got, the wind meter, I'm going to get an accurate wind reading, and look at this, now I know that really well. And based on all these things I figured out, I'm going to take my first shot, and I have a way higher chance of actually hitting that target on my first shot.
Absolutely, because now we have all of those variables that we can account for accounted for.
Right.
So it's going to take a little bit of that guesswork out of the equation.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to wind reading as a whole, I would say it's more of an art than a science.
Yeah, that's something else. I mean, it's almost too difficult for us to describe.
Absolutely.
On a podcast, because you actually have to see it.
Yeah. So people may be thinking, if you're listening or possibly watching, like, okay, well, wind, I thought we were talking about ballistics. Well, depending on your ballistics, you can have more effect or less effect with that wind.
Yeah. And the ballistics is the study of projectiles flying through the air. So, it also goes into the gun too a little bit. But I mean, you got to factor in the wind, because there's just wind out there.
The biggest reason for misses at distance.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you guys, when you teach wind in classes, I mean, it's got to be one of those things, like, you kind of just have to go out and just stand for a little while and just look out there and be like,
we do. Now, the way we kind of have it broke up is we almost dedicate a full day just to wind.
Yeah.
And you have to. And you're not going to learn wind in one day.
No.
But that's what we do. We kind of talk. We sit down. We kind of talk with them, talk about the formulas, talk about how to find those variables we need to input into that formula.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of talk about in the classroom. Then we go outside.
Right.
And then we're like, okay, well, like you said earlier, oh, what's the wind? Oh, oh, shoot, I was off. So we go through that exercise. But again, we know we're not shooting a target at our location. So then we actually do...
The wind at the muzzle that you're getting, where you're shooting from, is at least the only wind that you can get just an absolute spot-on number on. So it's not... You shouldn't overlook that, even though you realize, it's not one of those, I'm discouraged because I can't get winds, 1,000 times between me and the target. Like, that's a really important one to get at the muzzle. But there's just a lot else going on.
Absolutely. And when we teach winds, we do that, and then we... do wind reading exercises at distance.
Yeah.
So we'll go to various distances, different places on the range. We'll have maybe like a wind indicator out there, such as smoke or flags or, something like that, where now we're like, okay, well, based on what I see, this is what I think the wind's doing at that location.
Yeah.
So, and then we'll relay it via radio. Same thing. Hold up the Kestrel and...
Yeah. And your topography, the landscape, all these things will influence it. Winds are rarely just right to left, left to right. You use that frequently to describe it, and I know it's kind of wrapped up in the name of our left-right turret. I point like there's a gun over my shoulder, and there's not. I forgot. But it's used in the name of the left-right turret called the windage turret.
Yeah.
And people oftentimes then think, they're like, well, it's either going to push it left or it's going to push it right. Ultimately, I mean, that is a lot of what it does.
Yeah.
But you forget that in a certain landscape you're in, the wind may be at the muzzle, it may be doing one thing, and if you're shooting across, say, I mean, a canyon is a bit dramatic, but even here in Wisconsin, we have so much topography. There's like a lot of rolling hills. None of them are mountains by any means, but we have a lot of what I just call bowls.
And the way we describe it?
And they're the worst. And just the wind
you get swirls.
And it does everything. It's not even that you can say, over there is a left to right wind. You can just say, over there is basically an invisible tornado, and it could do anything. Like, I can't even tell you.
I'm just going to hold center and hope for the best.
Yeah, yeah.
But we say, like, wind acts like water. So For example, if you have like a mountain stream, where's that water going to pick up speed? Where's it going to slow down? When that stream narrows, what's going to happen to that water? Same thing.
Sure.
It's going to pick up speed. Maybe you have, some of those bowls, same thing, like you have the swirling water
Kind of
effects.
like you can be like eddies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So wind kind of acts like water in that, sense.
Yeah, it does. I was about to say, if only there was constant smoke in the air that you could visually see what the moon was doing, except then that'd be like a lot of pollution. It'd be a really big problem. It would be basically be in LA at that point. So we don't want that. Good stuff.
Yeah,
is there anything
absolutely.
else? Part of this is going to be related to you guys listening. So I'm referencing those of you on YouTube right now, or those of you just listening to the podcast itself. There's going to be things that you run into where you're like, hey, I want to know more details on this. So in Ballistics for Nerds, just by wanting to know more details about something, that you're kind of fulfilling that ballistic nerd category, and you should let us know. I mean, these are some of the ones that Justin has deemed as being, this is a great next step to things for you, or great next step in things for you to continue learning and getting better with. But again, maybe there's other stuff. But is there, Justin, can you think of anything else that's like, yeah, we should go over this today?
There's so many things.
Yeah.
We could talk about, when we talk about ballistics, we break it up internal, external, and terminal ballistics. We can talk about, what changes occur inside the gun to affect those external ballistics.
Oh, yeah, like cold bore shot versus a hot barrel.
Absolutely. So with advanced ballistics, or Ballistics for Nerds, you can get down as far deep in that rabbit hole as you want to go. And you can dive down that with standard deviation. You can dive down that with, internal ballistics. You can dive down that with, aerodynamic jump.
Yeah.
So there's so many different things that, affect trajectory and then the flight of that bullet at distance.
Yeah. So that's a challenge to you folks out there, to start looking into details and start looking into factors and variables in shooting that you want to know more about. Let us know, because then we can talk about them. Otherwise, we'll just keep doing our best, keep guessing things that you might be interested in, and we'll just keep talking. So there's that. Definitely let us know in the comments or over on Instagram at Vortex Edge, all that good stuff. But otherwise, Justin, I think we'll put a cap on this one for now. We'll let people really simmer on that information we threw their way, and hopefully there will be more. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
See you in the next one. Bye.
That's a wrap, everybody. Hope you liked this topic. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and of course, subscribe right here, because there's going to be plenty more to come. If there's topics you'd like to hear us go over on the Vortex Edge podcast in the future, you can let us know by commenting below or hitting us up on Instagram, which is at Vortex Edge. We'd love to hear your suggestions so we can be bringing you the kind of episodes and topics that you want to hear. Otherwise, we'll be seeing you on a future episode. Thanks again for watching, everybody. Bye.